And the king arose in his wrath from the wine drinking and went into the palace garden. But Haman stayed to beg for his life from Queen Esther. For he saw that harm was determined against him by the king. And the king returned from the palace garden to the place where they were drinking wine, as Haman was falling on the couch where Esther was. And the king said, "Will he even assault the queen in my presence, in my own house?" As the word left the mouth of the king, they covered Haman's face. Then Haman, one of the eunuchs in attendance on the king, said, "Moreover, the gallows that Haman has prepared for Mordecai, whose word saved the king, is standing at Haman's house, 50 cubits high." And the king said, "Hang him on that." So they hanged Haman on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai. Then the wrath of the king abated. On the day King Ahasuerus gave the Queen Esther the house of Haman, the enemy of the Jews. And Mordecai came before the king, for Esther had told what he was to her. And the king took off his signet ring, which he had taken from Haman, and gave it to Mordecai. And Esther set Mordecai over the house of Haman. Then Esther spoke again to the king. She fell at his feet and wept and pleaded with him to avert the evil plan of Haman, the Agagite, and the plot that he had devised against the Jews. When the king held out the golden scepter to Esther, Esther rose and stood before the king, and she said, "If it please the king, and if I have found favor in his sight, and if the things seem right before the king, and I am pleasing in his eyes, let an order be written to revoke the letters devised by Haman the Agagite, the son of Hammedatha, which he wrote to destroy the Jews, who are in all the provinces of the king. For how can I bear to see the calamity that is coming to my people? Or how can I bear to see the destruction of my kindred?" Then King Ahasuerus said to Queen Esther and to Mordecai the Jew, "Behold, I have given Esther the house of Haman, and they have hanged him on the gallows, because he intended to lay hands on the Jews. But you may write as you please with regard to the Jews, in the name of the king, and seal it with the king's ring. For an edict written in the name of the king and sealed with the king's ring cannot be revoked."
The king's scribes were summoned at that time in the 3rd month, which is the month of Sivan, on the 23rd day, and an edict was written, according to all that Mordecai commanded concerning the Jews, to the satraps and the governors and the officials of the provinces from India to Ethiopia, 127 provinces, to each province in its own script, and to each people in its own language, and also to the Jews in their script and their language. And he wrote in the name of King Ahasuerus, and sealed it with the king's signet ring. Then he sent the letters by mounted couriers riding on swift horses that were used in the king's service, bred from the royal stud, saying that the king allowed Jews who were in every city to gather and defend their lives, to destroy, to kill, and to annihilate any armed force of any people or province that might attack them, children and women included, and to plunder their goods. On one day, throughout all the provinces of King Ahasuerus, on the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month of Adar, a copy of what was written was to be issued as a decree in every province, being publicly displayed to all the peoples and the Jews that were ready on that day to take vengeance on their enemies. So the couriers, mounted on their swift horses that were used in the king's service, rode out hurriedly, urged by the king's command. And the decree was issued in Susa, the citadel. Then Mordecai went out from the presence of the king in royal robes of blue and white, with a great golden crown and a robe of fine linen and purple, and the city of Susa shouted and rejoiced. The Jews had light and gladness and joy and honor, and in every province and in every city, wherever the king's command and his edict reached, there was gladness and joy among the Jews, a feast and a holiday. And many from the peoples of the country declared themselves Jews, for fear of the Jews had fallen on them.
Well, the hits keep coming for Haman, don't they? I can remember a few summers back, we were on family vacation and gotten dressed for a full day of sightseeing. And as a family, we rented electric bicycles. It was a gorgeous day. And we got the cutest family picture as we set out on our adventure. One of my daughters, who was planning to make an epic trip video, had her phone out and was capturing a steady stream of B-roll as we explored. But in literally a split second, she waffled in her steadiness and crashed violently to the ground. The camera recorded the entire upheaval. And then, minutes into us trying to render first aid to her, a thunderstorm came barreling over the mountains. The temperature dropped 30 degrees and it began raining all over us. By the time we got back to home base, we were soaking wet, freezing, and one of us was bleeding. It happened so fast. It left our heads spinning, and our mirroring picture from beginning to end in the same spot where we had left off just a couple of hours before, well, it told a completely opposite story. I imagine Haman felt similarly. He walked into the banquet that second night as a trusted advisor to the king, bearing his signet ring, and he left being torn off the queen with a bag over his head, headed for the gallows. We spent a couple of sessions now unpacking the decisions, the pride, and the blind spots that led Haman to this fate. Today, however, I want us to look at the king's response. The first thing I think we see is that the king is being betrayed. Have you ever been betrayed? It takes a moment to process it, and it appears that it was no different for the king. You see, this king in particular rarely operates without counsel around him. He is very swayed by his advisors. We've seen that time and again in the text. So when he is confronted with one of his most trusted advisors' betrayal, he actually leaves the situation. We can surmise he needed some fresh air, and that's his response. That's what is recorded in Scripture. He left the table and he went to the garden. Now, whether he found clarity with the fresh air, we don't know. But when he returned to find Haman in the personal space of his queen, a violation, by the way, he is resolute. Haman must die. The second thing that I think we see in King Ahasuerus is that he is generous. He responds by generously giving his signet ring to Mordecai. He gives Haman's house to Esther. This is yet another reversal in the account. And we can assume that he feels pretty smug about this. He is making a decision all on his own, and he does the right thing. It feels good to be generous, and it feels good to make honorable decisions. But let's not be too generous in our account of the king, because the third thing I think we find in his response is apathy. We pretty quickly see that the king isn't willing to take this whole thing too far. It appears that though he has admiration and perhaps even affection for Esther and Mordecai, he is not really interested in going too far out on a limb for their people. He is not willing to get his hands too dirty personally. I mean, let's remember point number 2. He's already been very generous, so he feels like he's done enough. Now, here's what's interesting. We've already discussed the king is very swayed by his advisors. And what we see is that when the king's advisors are bad, he tends to be bad. But when the king's advisors are good, like Mordecai and Esther, well, he tends to be good. But what we see consistently about him is he does not seem to be a man of conviction. He is someone who is swayed by those around him. I wonder how many of us tend to be a little more like the king. We rise to the expectation of those in our immediate circle, but we don't act with courage. We don't act with conviction. We see the king, he gave his stamp of approval for whatever it was that Esther and Mordecai came up with, but he didn't display any urgency or ideas or any interest in being personally involved to see it accomplished. Once again, we see courage and conviction coming at the hands of Esther and Mordecai. Unable to repeal the king's edict, they find a workaround. And all of a sudden, the Jews are now dealt a favorable hand. They have hope of coming out on top. So much so that we read in the account that there were others, non-Jews, who wanted to associate them just to have that favor that they were enjoying. We have 2 sessions left as we seek to unpack the account of Esther. But today, we leave her in good hands, serving together with Mordecai, seeking to save her people and influence the king. As you study, I encourage you to consider, who are you allowing to speak into your life and your decisions? And further, who are you speaking into? Who are you providing wise counsel to? Where have you been willing to act with courage and conviction and resolve? Let's dig in together alongside the people whom God has placed and surrounded us with, because it's worth it.